Mine's working.
Now it is.
There you go. Okay. Halfway to my screen this time. Oh boy. Okay. Technology and me do not always agree. Yeah. Okay, we will open this meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. The first item of business is citizen comments. Do we have any citizens who would care to share comments? Okay, please state your name and address for the record, please.
Hi, my name is Mark Lamb, and I represent Kenmore Mobile Home Park LLC, and I'm here to talk a little bit tonight about the proposed changes that you are considering to the comprehensive plan and some alternative approaches that I think should be in the process to help both the owners and also the residents of the mobile home park. I noticed in your packet tonight that at the end of it, there was an exchange between Jacob Stillwell and Lori Anderson about the legality of requiring basically a right of first refusal or right of first rent in these sorts of transactions. And one thing that we talked about at the city council level when they were considering this is that the city council had a genuine concern for the people, the current residents of these mobile home parks, and the ones that are to the north of our main intersection or of the main thoroughfare are ones that are, as the packet discusses tonight, are close to highly developable properties that are ones that you believe, consistent with your existing comprehensive plan, should at some point change in their character and development. What I would encourage you as a planning commission to do is to build in a mechanism and to work in good faith with the owners of the mobile home parks that are identified as being ones that ultimately will transition, to have a framework of a development agreement and between the city and those park owners, such that you would be able to provide relief for residents of the mobile home parks that you can't do just through statute alone. For example, that could take the form of rent relief, that could take the form of a right of first offer, that could take the form of even a payment of compensation to individual residents. But that framework right now is missing. That what is in there is a relatively complicated formula of density that I'm concerned may not have much practical utility in the real world. And it may actually not really be of that much benefit to the residents of the mobile home park themselves, is that it would say, you might say, okay, well, there needs to be an affordability component. If you're currently in a mobile home park paying the rents that mobile home parks ask, that might be effectively meaningless to you. And so I would encourage you to, develop a procedure by which the city council and the planning commission can build in a mechanism for an interlocal agreement, which would be an alternative to sort of this 10-year period of time of waiting period where the only off-ramp is either this formula of density credits or a provision whereby the city manager has to certify that it's economically unfeasible. I know that my client has said that he's more than willing to work, and you're going to hear from him in a moment, but he's more than willing to work with the Planning Commission, with the City Council, and with city staff, and he's made me available to help work with you guys to come up with language on that. I think that what would be another important thing to consider as you move forward is if you believe that these properties will and sort of should change at some point in the future, what is the best way to build in a mechanism in which the residents can be taken care of and the owners can be taken care of and the city can be taken care of? Because that's something that I think collaboratively has worked in other jurisdictions and I think would be extremely beneficial to the people here. And I think as it's currently drafted, the existing residents of the mobile home parks may very well be left behind. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you have, and I would encourage you, if you could, to allow for public comment in your deliberations as well, so that we have an opportunity to weigh in again as the conversation moves forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next is Daniel Stoner.
Good evening, Planning Commission, City staff. My name is Daniel Stoner, and I'm speaking tonight on behalf of the Lakewood Mobile Home Park located at 6837 Northeast 182nd, immediately behind City Hall here, and Jim Perkins, the owner of two other mobile home parks located on 181st. Combined, we represent almost 5 acres of the downtown core here in Kenmore. On behalf of Jim and myself, I want to voice my objection and concern with locking in a new zoning for 10 years without any provision for the city, the owners, or the residents to modify it through a development agreement. I have 20 years of experience in quality real estate development, so I'm very familiar with the variables involved: construction costs, construction loans, rental rates, and other assumptions of risk in building a building. And they change constantly, which is why I'm so troubled by the current course of action and want to invite you to work with stakeholders directly to make appropriate changes. Now, the planners in the city are well-meaning and very competent, but the current proposal asks them to work backwards on calculating the public-private benefit of an affordability restriction by creating some hypothetical development using simple variables, making a wide array of assumptions based on current economic conditions, current construction costs, and current rental rates to arrive at some hypothetical benefit. There are two problems with this. First, all of these assumptions are done under current conditions that undoubtedly will be very different in the future. Capitalization rates, construction costs, rents will dramatically affect the economics of a project. So drawing conclusions years from now based on current variables is not good public policy. Second, these assumptions are made without the benefit of development experience. Here's an example. The scenario that the city staff proposed indicates 131 units per acre. It requires that a developer build every unit available through density bonuses, which makes sense in a vacuum. Yet the reality is construction costs, market analysis, rental absorption rates will ultimately dictate the building design and thus the number of units built, frequently being significantly less than the maximum unit yield, just by economics. Yet if my hands are tied to maxing out the development potential, that may prevent me from getting construction financing, ultimately eliminating my ability to redevelop the property. Perhaps that's the ultimate goal here. Perhaps you want these parks to remain one of the largest pieces of undeveloped land located in the heart of downtown Kenmore as a nearly 60-year-old mobile home park that was never intended to last longer than after the World's Fair in 1962. Perhaps that's what you want your downtown to look like 5, 10, 20 years from now. But if you truly want to transform your downtown into a walkable, transit, and family-oriented dense community with realistic and achievable affordability components, while recognizing and protecting the needs of the current mobile home occupants, I stand ready, willing, and able to meet with the Planning Commission to discuss the terms of a development agreement. I think that's the most effective way to actually create a win-win scenario to give us some certainty on how we can proceed someday in the future and give some comfort and certainty to the existing residents. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approval of the May 7th Planning Commission meeting minutes. Do we hear a motion? Second? Been moved and seconded to approve the minutes from May 7th. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? Motion passes unanimously. Next agenda item is Phase 2 of the Manufactured Housing Communities Project. And invite the city staff and representative of Arch to join us. before we get started, and maybe this is already on your agenda, but I guess it would be helpful, and maybe you're already planning to do this, just to kind of go over the scope of our project here as a planning commission relative to what the gentleman shared with us, so we can all kind of understand what we're doing here and what our parameters are and what we're looking at and what the council has asked us to do. So if you could somehow include that in your remarks.
Well, I think the council recently passed the ordinance which put the mobile home park zoning over all 6 parks. They then had a separate resolution which provided then the work program for the Planning Commission was to look at what should happen to the 4 parks north of SR 522 after a 10-year period. So the intention was that that mobile home park zoning would apply to those 4 parks north of SR 522 for 10 years. And after 10 years, the intention then there would be an allowance then for an increase in density and including some affordability component. So the Planning Commission is then tasked with considering comprehensive plan amendments related to that phase zoning and coming up with then terms of that phased zoning to then present back to the City Council.
If I could just ask then, they suggested development agreements. Is that something that's within the scope that we can consider as a planning commission?
My perspective on that is that the zoning was to remain in place. A development agreement is a tool that you use when you do not want or desire to conform to the current standards. I think the notion of including a development agreement perhaps at the 10-year threshold is maybe something that would be useful to allow, since we're going into the future, to allow for creative options. But I do not think that the City Council would be expecting you to come forward with a development agreement at this point, since that would in some ways undermine the decision that they just made about the zoning.
I think it would be fair to say that what the recommendation that the Planning Commission sends forward, we would expect that to be viable and feasible, understanding that there are assumptions, and we would certainly be very willing to, given Mr. Stoner's experience as a developer and being as he is an owner of one of the large mobile home parks here, to get his perspective on what would be reasonable in terms of being economically viable. You know, the city, we have to make assumptions all the time about what the future will look like, and we put the zoning and land use regulations in place to try and achieve that vision, understanding that as conditions change, there is always the ability to change regulations, and sometimes a development agreement is a tool that has been used in certain zones, that if somebody wants to do something different, a development agreement is that tool to allow that to happen.
Is that currently available under a development agreement for these particular properties?
It is not a tool that is currently available for the mobile home park community zoning.
So I just have a question. If there was a creative solution that benefited the mobile home owners and the property managers in the city that could be implemented before the 10 years, it sounds like that's not something that we're dealing with in this ask, the current ask. But I'm curious if my understanding is correct on that. And then if somebody did have an idea of something that would be beneficial, how would they go about bringing that to the council, given the current?
Right. So development agreements are allowed only in certain zones. And so, again, a development agreement is a tool where the council decides whether they want to listen to an alternative. And if they choose to do so, then the applicant goes through a process and determines what the trade-offs are and what public benefits will be provided. I think that a development agreement is a great tool. I think for the Planning Commission to go back at this point and say, well, we don't think it should be 10 years, we think there should be a development agreement option, I think that subverts the resolution that the council passed on this topic. Again, for the future, given that we don't know what the future will bring, I think it probably makes sense to include the concept of a development agreement perhaps at the 10-year threshold when the zoning changes, to give someone some flexibility there to look at a different option. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I guess my question is still, so let's say that there was some kind of an idea that somebody had in 3 years that was beneficial to everyone. There's nothing saying that they can't approach the city and propose that the city look at something. Is that accurate?
A person can always approach
Yeah.
the city council and bring forward a perspective or a proposal, and then the city would decide whether the rules should be amended to allow that.
Okay, great. But for purposes of what we're doing, we're not touching the first 10 years.
I don't think that was the intent of the
Right.
resolution.
Okay,
Right.
thanks.
Any other questions at this, initial point? Okay, thank you.
So I think that what we are starting tonight is we have a draft of some comprehensive plan amendments, so we can go through those. That is, I believe, the first thing we'd like to tackle. And then secondly, we have Mike Stanger here from Arch, who is going to kind of go through some of the data and information on how the interplay between density, affordability, and economic feasibility works out. Understanding that this is kind of the first kind of time that you're looking at this, so obviously looking for some feedback, and as I said again, we were intending to hopefully contact Mr. Stoner to get his perspective as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Laurie, and she can go through the comp plan amendments, or unless you have any initial questions about the languages proposed. And we can pull that up on the screen for members of the audience.
Okay, so one thing that the resolution suggested the Commission consider were changes to the comprehensive plan to support the notion of the phased zoning. Again, the idea here is that it not be some decision into the future about what the zoning is going to change to. I think the council wanted to provide some certainty and reassure folks that the intent is not that this MHC zoning continue indefinitely. So the language that we've drafted here would appear in the land use element. It's in a section that talks about a number of things, and the main topic is future land use. So these amendments would talk about phased zoning, that it's an implementation tool. We haven't used it elsewhere, but under then this topic of phased zoning would be the first bullet point, which would talk about the manufactured housing communities, and then why there should be phased zoning, basically. So again, recognizing that it's part of the downtown vision, recognizing that to some degree we have that will have a need for more employment capacity, particularly as we get closer to our comprehensive plan horizon. Recognizing that bus rapid transit is coming to the city in 2024, hopefully, and that all of those parks are within walking distance of station areas. So basically what we're saying is that the MHCs north of SR 522 support future housing and employment growth in areas well served by transit, and that's consistent with the long-term vision for the city's downtown. As you recall, when the city amended the comprehensive plan map last fall, the two mobile home parks down on Northeast 175th Street were given a long-term designation of MHC, but the four north were not given that designation. And so as we think through what this future upzoning might look like, we probably would amend the map to whatever is the most appropriate designation. It may remain the same as it is currently. That's what is shown. So the initial 4 paragraphs are basically background information. And then the policy would be inserted into the plan that says phase zoning should be applied to the 4 existing manufactured housing communities north of SR 522 to acknowledge future growth pressures, the community's proximity to regional rapid transit, and the long-term vision for the areas as described in the downtown sub-element and on the land use plan map. Residential density increases and requirements for the provisions of affordable housing in any redevelopment are appropriate, as is increased commercial development capacity downtown. So those would be the guiding principles for the work that you're doing. And so this is our first cut at that, and your feedback is needed.
Well, I'll start with a maybe clarification question. When you say phase zoning, this would take effect like 10 years to the day of whenever the council ordinance was passed?
Right.
I
So
just want to
so the
clarify
way
that's
yeah.
what.
So the way it appears is that on the zoning map, there would be the current designation, which is MHC, and then there would be a label, basically, that says whatever the new zoning is, it's unlocked in, and I'm sure it would say 2029, not a specific date, so you could assume January 1st, and then what the new zoning would be. So it's an automatic change to the zoning. So for now it's this, but in 2029, this new zoning is unlocked. And as we get closer to knowing what that will look like, I will show you a map, but we don't know yet what it looks like, so can't do the map yet.
With the caveat that, again, it could be changed at any time by any future council, correct?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
always the case with zoning.
And when it goes into effect, what would be the immediate kind of effects that it would have on the mobile home communities?
So it would be a change to the zoning. So presumably there would be a higher density allowed. Again, employment capacity is important. So in some areas, employment or jobs are something that's allowed. In others, that might be something we want to look at. And then, so the zoning would change. There would be some sort of affordability requirement. That was a council request, although it need not match or be reflective of the current parks. And then at the same time, it would be the decision of the property owner as to what to do with their property. It's just that the zoning would change.
Do you think when that zoning changes, we would most likely be applying a zoning model that exists currently, downtown corridor, downtown residential, et cetera, or would we be devising something net new?
Yeah, my guess is it would probably be something that's currently applied. The densities might be higher. The current downtown residential density is, downtown residential and downtown commercial densities are 48 dwelling units per acre. And I think the idea was that there would be an increase in density, so there might have to be specific language written into, for example, the downtown commercial zone that says the densities in this area can be up to whatever the new number is.
So, and if we do take advantage of existing zoning applications, what's the mechanism for the affordability requirements attaching to that?
Well, that can be done a number of different ways. We have different models. One thing that we don't really have is a mandatory requirement. Most are incentive-based, and I think this would be different in that regard. But we have the TOD model. We have the model of Juanita, the Juanita Community Business Zone. So we can adopt something that we currently have, or we can devise something new. That is pretty much wide open.
Right. And Laura, can you remind me where the city is with an overall affordable housing review? a comprehensive affordable housing strategy
Right.
for the city, and how this may either run in parallel to that or fold into it?
Right. So as you know, taking up this project as a whole came right out of the housing strategy plan that the council adopted 3 years ago, maybe in 2015. And the housing strategy plan lays out different tiers of priority for things that the city council wants to look at. And you remember, some of you at least, that you helped prioritize those, and then the council adopted it. So the next priority that they have assigned to the Planning Commission for this year, when we've finished with this phase of this project, is accessory dwelling units, and looking at our standards there and what can we do to encourage more accessory dwelling units. Are there constraints currently? So that is the next phase. And then later this year, the council is asked to have a panel discussion from a wide variety of folks that will talk about different strategies for sort of zoning strategies for affordable housing. And we may glean some ideas out of that would be maybe change or move the priorities for the next piece that they pick out of the housing strategy plan. So this fits right in with the plan and where we're going with the plan. The issue is that as you know, this project was unusual in that what you took forward to the city council were options. You didn't move ahead with plan amendments or zoning amendments. So those were decided by the council, and then the council adopted the MHC zoning amendments, but said, okay, Planning Commission, you take this other piece of it, which is the future upzoning.
And one more question. What's the timing for the, I know we have a timeline in our cover memo today, but what's the timing for the adoption, as we work on this new policy language, what's the timeline for adoption of that? Is it with the comprehensive plan amendments in September?
Yeah, so there are two pieces. In an ideal world, and I'm not sure this is an ideal world, we would bring forward, the Planning Commission would bring forward a recommendation before the August recess. That's a very tight timeline. And then what would happen would be you would move on to other things, and everything would have sort of be in front of the council, but on hold until the comprehensive plan adoption, which happens probably in November, is my guess. Because we have the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, and the comp plan can only be amended once per year, except in certain instances. So those amendments have to wait until November for council action.
Anybody else have any, I guess, are you looking for some preliminary questions, or are you looking
Reactions,
for reactions?
Changes, amendments, things you like, things you don't like.
I guess maybe this is more of a procedural question. We do have a number of policy questions, which you repeated in the memo, thank you, that we need, I think, to go through before we get to any kind of finality on what the amendments would look like. And I see Mike is sitting over here probably chomping at the bit to give us some education, which I think we probably need to have before we tackle those policies. Is that your plan?
Well, the policies are, again, foundational. They're not directive as the zoning is. So Mike's piece of it is really going to talk about the zoning. But certainly if you feel like you want to fold the whole thing together, you can take that approach. They'll go forward together, the comprehensive plan and the zoning amendments.
I'm looking particularly at the two policy questions that we raised in the earlier meeting, which are, what's the number of affordable units and what's the maximum density?
Right.
And it seems to me like having some answers and some education on what the economics of these are might help us come up with a better answer to those two questions. So I don't know if you wanted, what order you wanted to take this in.
Yeah, if you don't feel comfortable looking at the comprehensive plan language until you've had that more specific zoning discussion, that's fine. The draft zoning amendments that were provided to the city council were in your packet, the very first packet where we tackled this topic. And so, you know, staff did some preliminary work, and it seemed like the really critical thing was what numbers to plug in and kind of what zoning to assign. So, so I'm not sure that you're going to have to create out of whole cloth the zoning amendments, but more direction on the density, the level of affordability, and the mechanism for the affordability.
Well, I like Commissioner Van der Lijn's approach. Anybody else have any thoughts on just procedurally how we want to tackle this? Okay.
Well, I guess I am curious. Did you say that there you'd be presenting to us the feasibility or maybe the benefits of the zoning, maybe economic or
Right. So Mike is here, and he's going to talk. I'll speak for him initially, and then he's going to speak for himself. He hopes. What we're hoping to do tonight is provide our view of the relationship between density, how many units per acre should be permitted, and affordability. What should an affordability requirement look like? You know, is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it a tiered approach? Is it 2 for 1? There are a number of ways that can be handled. And then the third piece is Mike is going to walk through the handout that, modified handout that you were given. And really what that attempts to do is look at, first of all, you assume that when a project comes in for review, you assume that it's economically feasible, or they wouldn't be proposing the project. And then what we're trying to do is see relatively how affordable housing requirements might affect that feasibility. And so that's what Mike is going to describe. So we're going to be looking at feasibility, affordability, and density. And then we'll hope to vet that and come back to you with some recommendations. And you may have recommendations tonight. You may have thoughts tonight on what you think is the best approach.
Thank you.
Okay, so it sounds like we have a desire to, again, sort of get educated first.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll leave it up to you how you want to proceed with that education.
So I hope I can speak loudly enough for you. I've been dealing with a difficult cough. I apologize for that. But what I wanted to offer was some ways to think about zoning for affordable housing and incentives for affordable housing. And as Lori said, when we're doing this kind of analysis, we're thinking that the projects that come forward are already feasible from the developer's point of view. And the part that you're playing in zoning with the incentives and requirements is just either potentially adding to or detracting from that feasibility. We want to try and create a system that creates affordable units in Kenmore without detracting from the feasibility of the project that the developer would otherwise propose. Therefore, we're in this analysis or modeling that we do, we're trying to ensure that the value return to developer comes out a little positive or at worst neutral for them. The way that we do that is by comparing the value that the developer gets from these incremental changes in the zoning versus what the city gets in terms of the value of the affordable housing. The city's value or the public value in affordable housing we think of as the gap between market rents and affordable rents. What the developer sees that as is lost revenue. On the flip side, it's public value because it's money tenants are saving on their rent. The developer's value or the private value results that we're looking for come in chiefly in terms of additional units. It might be through a density bonus, as Lori said, or a straight up zoning to a property. And we quantify that in terms of the value of the land, because it's as if when the city gives more density or allows more units to be built, it's as if under the existing zoning, the owner is getting more land. So we use that equivalent of a land price per unit as that value. Other values that the developer can get under incentives are multifamily tax exemption, which the city has in place in the across the street here and also in the TOD overlay area, but not in the immediate downtown area at this time. And other incentives such as impact fee waivers for affordable units, which the city has in place, and a few other things that we could talk about that aren't really as lucrative usually. Let's see. So to evaluate, we go through a modeling exercise where we're making certain assumptions, and I listed the main ones across the middle there, to understand the land price per unit, and this is how many developers look at it when they're looking at the feasibility, is how much does the land they're looking to buy cost per unit that they can build, or the price per door. In terms of the MFTE, that involves assumptions for assessed values, and tax rates, and a discount rate to bring a present value to that exemption. And then other factors are involved with other incentives. We also make assumptions for what market rents are, because as I said, we need to know what that gap is between market rents and the affordable rents. And then the capitalization rate is a factor that's used to, again, bring to present value a stream of income over time. So I'll explain that a little bit more later. Then the controls is what I'm calling the things that you would build into your zoning. So that would be affecting the incentives and also the increased development capacity of the property. The affordable units, you'll be thinking in terms of what percentage of units would be affordable, or how many bonus units to the property for each affordable unit, something like that. And then I mentioned some other controls. Right now, the fee waivers are in place, waive 80% of the transportation and parks impact fees for each affordable unit. Reduce parking. You can, we'll look at the what requirements are in place. You may already know those better than I do, but the city has, control zoning in your purview. You could potentially recommend changes to parking requirements for affordable units or for a project overall. So those are the things that are going to go into this model. Before we look at that, though, I want to remind you of a table that was in your packet for your last meeting. And at that meeting, or in that table, it showed the densities and existing number of homes at the 4 parks that we're dealing with north of the thoroughfare. And the density on, the existing density on 3 of those 4 is 48 per acre, and on 1 is 24 per acre. So on the 3rd column, A shows the number of units that could be built under that zoning. Let me correct myself a second. That's the old zoning. The current zoning, as you know, is mobile home manufactured housing community, which is 12 per acre. For the purpose of this analysis, though, we're not going to take any credit for restoring what they used to have. In other words, we're going to count or evaluate from the standpoint of the zoning or the density that they used to have. Hope that makes sense? No, not totally. Maybe you can help me with this. So, right now, the maximum density on those properties would be 12 per acre. That's really only good for manufactured housing or something low density. When the city institutes the new zoning and starts giving, how did I explain it this morning?
Okay. When the city is thinking in 10 years of doing an upzone, I think what we're saying is that we don't view the baseline as 12 dwelling units per acre. We view the baseline as the zoning that they had before the MHC zoning was passed. So the upzoning is not from 12 dwelling units per acre. It is from whatever the previous zoning was. So in downtown commercial, for example, the baseline that we're thinking of is 48, and that's not really an upzoning to go back to 48. So the idea is it would be more than 48 or 24 or whatever the previous zoning was.
The property owner would say, if you're only restoring me to 48 per acre, you're not really doing me any favors. So that's why I'm looking at those densities rather than the 12 per acre. Then moving across to the moderate income, the idea was if the city increased the zoning by 3 units for every affordable unit required until there were enough affordable units to equal the number of existing mobile homes on the property, how many units would you have to allow on those parcels? And so in the first case, it would be it would have to go from 11 mobile homes to 84 units in order to have 11 affordable units. In the second case, it would have to go from 20 mobile homes to 127 in order to get 20 affordable units. In that case, that would be 91 units per acre, and so forth. Yes, sir.
You're reminding me of a conversation we had a while back looking at similar numbers. Maybe just using that first example of 7,000 Northeast 181st. At a density of 84, can the property support that? What sort of building would you have on that lot size that would allow 84 units?
That's something that we'll have to explore some more. I have some examples later on of existing projects that could help give us some perspective on that. But we also hope to talk with property owners and developers to get a better feel for that and see whether that would be something that you would want to see on those properties.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, when we looked at this last time, we became aware that the differing sizes of these properties created some limitations, and to get to some of these higher numbers, you'd actually end up with a 50-story needle or something. I'm exaggerating.
Right.
But it'd be something that probably wouldn't be what we want to have downtown.
Sure.
Unless there was some sort of property consolidation.
So, and I want to clarify, one of the policy questions before you, which the council did not direct your way at all, was this question of whether you are supposed to be replacing a certain number of units. For example, it's very different to say you have to put 84 units on the property versus saying the number in parentheses, which is the dwelling units per acre. So at 79 dwelling units per acre, that's really what you're manipulating. You're not manipulating, that is going to do your outside envelope, but it doesn't talk about size of units, it doesn't talk about anything like that. And we have, some of you may recall, we had a series of photos last time around, and it might be good to bring those forward again as a refresher, with very high densities, not not much bigger than some of these properties. So I think it's worthwhile taking a look at those.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was kind of leading to, is we can have the discussion we're having now, which in my mind is kind of building it from the bottom up. But I think we have to look at what the end product would be to understand what it is we're really suggesting would happen. And I think the visuals of those that you had of similar properties, similar densities, and then within those properties, what was the square footage per unit, or what was the unit configuration? We need to have that, I think, against, to make these numbers meaningful, to make them real.
Absolutely, right. And just to reiterate, I'm really tonight just trying to explain how we analyze these things, and not ready yet to suggest what a good solution would be. But so on the so that this is again going back to the way we had described the possibility scenarios previously, and on the right-hand side, if you were to aspire to having low-income units, that is affordable at 50% of median, we used a bonus figure of 6 additional units per affordable unit here. And then in the last 2 columns, you can see what the total number of units that would be on those parcels, what the density per acre would be, and the percentage of units that would be affordable. Again, to replace the manufactured housing, even though it's not incumbent on you to try and replace those. This is kind of a parameter we're putting out ourselves right now.
Right, that's a policy choice
Right.
for you to think about.
So this is a set of tables that should resemble what was in the very back of your packet. But what I've done here is to replace the project information, the prototype project information and assumptions with information that matches what you were just looking at. In other words, I was taking the property next door here at 6837, I think it was. Yeah. And using the base density at 48 per acre, building it out to 347 units, so that it would create 48 affordable units. And I plugged in the rest of the project information, the market rents, the unit mix. I took from information that we've received from the Link project across the street. So as of earlier this year, those are the rents that they were getting, and the mixture of unit types. The parking ratios I took from the city's code, and took a weighted average of that, and the weighted average for the market rent. So if we plugged in a different unit configuration, a different type of project, we might come up with a different average rent or a different average parking ratio. But those are factors that feed down through the model. It would require 275 parking spaces, and a rough estimate for structured parking at this time is $50,000 per space. Land cost is running about $40,000 or so last we checked. Got last year's impact fees. I don't know if those have been changed since then. I may need to update that. And I'm using for this scenario a capitalization rate of 5%. And then looking at 2 situations on this property. One, and comparing back to the previous slide, one in which you had 48 units of housing affordable at 70% of median, and one where, oh sorry, I'm not doing the low income here. They're both at 70% of median. The difference in case one is that we're just giving them the upzone. In case two, we're adding a reduction for parking. So we're reducing the parking requirement from 1.18 on average to 1.0 parking spaces per unit. I think I misspoke earlier. It yields 63 affordable units. And the average rent is $15.32 a month versus the weighted average of $2,004 for market units. So that's where we're going to take the rent cap. They're getting 126 additional units above what they would have gotten with just the 48 per acre. The second case saves them 41 parking spaces. And the result is that in the first case, where they're just getting the upzone, the city is gaining a public benefit of $75,000 in rent gap per affordable unit. And the developer is getting something on the order of $87,000 per affordable unit in the value for additional capacity and fee waivers. The ratio between those comes out as a 1.2 in favor of the developer. If you add in the parking savings, then the developer gets an additional $48,000 per affordable unit, because they don't have to build as much parking. And that increases the ratio in their favor to 1.8. In other words, they're getting $1.80 for every dollar of benefit in the affordable housing. Any questions so far?
Well, I'll start out. The rent gap, that's the only quantifiable public benefit that is used here?
That's the only one that's used here. I mean, you could consider that there would be additional property taxes, sales taxes coming as a result of the development.
Okay, but it's the only one used for this
Right.
this purpose. Okay, I guess my second, I don't know if it's a question or observation, but in 10 years, how different might these numbers be in terms of both the rent gap and the private benefits? I mean, if we're supposed to be, considering, I know that's our charge, to consider, what's gonna look like in 10 years.
That's a fair question.
I'm not sure how we're supposed to, and I know this came up before, we're not Nostradamuses here, at least I'm not. I'm just not sure how to approach the numbers
Right.
personally. So any suggestions would be helpful.
Well, first of all, because it's a model that we can adjust the variables, we can look at any number of scenarios. We can adjust all those factors that we've been talking about and come and see if there are patterns, see what the sensitivity is to different figures and so forth. Second, the idea of using the cap rate is that when an investor buys an existing property, then they are looking at the net cash flow that they would be getting from that property. They're looking at that value in the present time, and they're projecting it over time by using this capitalization rate. And so it's fair to use that kind of in reverse in this situation, because it's the amount of money that the owner would lose over time, and that what the market is, how the market is establishing the cap rate speaks to what they perceive that value to be over time. So the cap rate, in other words, helps take care of some of that.
Well, I guess I think there is certainly I don't know how other people feel, but, you know, some set of scenarios to give at least some sense of the, you know, the variation that might occur in 10 years seems helpful. I don't, obviously, there's probably an unlimited number of scenarios you could cook up. What are you talking about? Like how many scenarios are feasible for us to consider?
Well, I'm going to jump in here. I think, you know, what you're dealing with is zoning. You're not making a determination on a specific project.
Right.
So the model is useful in looking at broad trends and identifying issues. But for example, the TOD was zoned to 150 dwelling units per acre, and I don't think there were economic feasibility analyses done at that time. So you're going to, in some ways, we can use this as a foundation and hopefully reflect the differences between the different parameters, but it's going to be a leap of faith. We're not asking you to do the pro forma for a project 10 years into the future. We want to try to be, I think, generous. I think it's important to remember that these are properties that BRT will serve into the future. One of the policy questions was, do you care what the upper end, the density upper end is? I mean, would you think that downtown it should be higher than the TOD? Do you think the TOD is probably the maximum? And that's when I think the illustrations will help to show you what different densities look like in neighboring communities.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Wanted to understand how this modeling would am I correct in believing that this modeling isn't something that gets put into statute or gets put into a comprehensive plan? What we're using this for is a tool to evaluate our policy decisions, and the policy decisions is what would be built into whatever decisions we come up with on the comprehensive plan amendment. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, absolutely.
So when I look at this, you know, the things I look at are exactly what Mike has pointed out, is what are the assumptions that are in here, and how does that relate back to the policy decisions? And I think the two policy decisions that we had in front of us, which we would use this model, this type of modeling to test, is what is the level of affordable units that we think is reasonable? If we put that in here, does that pencil out to be an economic project that meets our public needs? And then what is the affordability limit that we want within those individual units? And you plug that in, and then we take a look and see what does that look like. Is that where you'd be going with this, Mike?
Yes, sir.
And I do want to point out that the good news is that Mr. Stoner is here this evening, but Mr. Stoner is a developer and has been holding his property for development. And so Mike and I, when we were looking at some of these things this morning, Mike suggested we need to maybe sit down with Mr. Stoner. So we are going to invite you. I think Mr. Stoner is unique in that he is a developer. The other owners, to my knowledge, do not have that particular background. But anyway, I put that out there.
But just one more question. I wanted to make sure I understand the model correctly. So looking at this particular rendition of the model, we're looking at the assumption that there's 347 units would be built, and of those, 63 would be affordable. So we're looking at, and today, given the property that you're modeling against, how many mobile home units are there today in there?
63.
So this would preserve the current number of affordable units on the property today.
That's where I have a question, and that's in the future. You know, let's say we go 10 years in the future. I don't know what rate the mobile home rents are increasing compared to what we have in a model, to know whether someone who's being displaced from the mobile home could afford even the most affordable of the housing. And I know we're not supposed to necessarily consider or take care of that, but I've heard the council comment in have concern for the residents, and there have been residents here who have a concern for where they're going to be in 10 years. So I'm just trying to kind of figure that one out. And then I also don't know how many, if it's typical for the mobile home owners to just rent the structure, or if they feel that they have equity and value in the mobile home, and then that gets lost if they're displaced, if that's considered
Right.
anywhere.
Yeah, and both you and Commissioner Lutzis are a little bit in a difficult spot because the rest of the commission heard the story last year. But so in all cases, the mobile homes are owned. I think maybe it was a very small number that we heard when we initially interviewed the owners. A very small number were rental, most were owned, and then in all cases, they rent the land that the mobile home sits on. So many of them do feel that they have equity in their home, although I think it's a different lending structure than you would have with a typical home. The rents, and again, I don't think the council was intending that you would necessarily respond to the rents in the mobile home communities, and partly it's because many of those, at least from the American Community Survey data we have, many of those make less than 35% of median income, and at that point it's very difficult sometimes to pencil out a project. At least that's my understanding. Mike will correct me if I'm wrong. So, and the other thing is that most of the mobile homes are 2-bedroom versus a 1-bedroom or a studio. So I think we came upon the idea of trying to replace the units, and the difficulty, first of all, we don't know what people are paying. That's a privacy issue. We have some general information about the folks who live in the parks, but we don't know exactly what their rents are. But I would say anecdotally, they're a lot less than the 2-bedroom market rents that you're seeing on this sheet.
To the first policy question, I think this came up at our last meeting. Again, the council's direction is not necessarily with this, to provide affordable housing strictly and specifically for the mobile home residents, correct? In terms of the context at which we're supposed to look at this, is that?
Right, that can be a question for you. That's a question.
That's a question as to whether we want to consider that, or?
You could use that as a parameter if you wanted to generally, again, not specifically because we don't have the information, but if generally you wanted to say, well, we could consider this, it's not that the council directed you to consider it. I think that's the point.
That they left it up to us?
Yeah.
Okay. Any thoughts on that by my colleagues there?
I would offer an observation. I'm not sure how much this is worth, but I'll throw it out there. In looking at the numbers that were provided to us earlier and then again in this letter, I note that the current Kenmore distribution of affordable housing looks a lot like the rest of the county. And so I'm looking at that and saying, well, if that's where we are today, is we're pretty much right there at the median, then that leads me to think that if we can maintain the current amount of affordable housing that we have today, then we should be putting ourselves or targeting ourselves even 10 years out to stay within that reasonable range of where particularly given that Kenmore has a fairly limited amount of developable space anyway. And even our growth estimates don't really look to be all that extreme. Right. So in my mind, and I put this out here for discussion, the idea of maintaining the current affordable units at the current level of the number of units that are in the mobile home parks seems to me like a way to keep us in a current steady state going forward. Okay. So that's the best logic I could come out of with the numbers we've got.
No, I appreciate that. The only caveat I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm reading it, for the very low income, it appears that Kenmore is well below the countywide. Am I reading that correctly on policy question number 3? Mike's right at the low income and moderate income. The very low income looks like Kenmore is 3% affordable, and the countywide need is 13% for very low income. So just with that
Yeah, and I think.
caveat at the very lowest income
that, I
levels,
think,
we're
would
maybe
segue us
not
into
where.
the second policy question is what's the level of affordability?
True. That definitely plays into that one, correct, yeah.
So, I mean, if you were to accept the train of thought, that duplicating the same number of units and then moving to affordability about how should they be distributed may be a way to get us to an equitable position that's consistent with where we are today, and best guess we could make about 10 years from now should keep a steady state and not deteriorate.
Commissioner Mulcahy.
Yeah, my concern, I guess, with that approach is that it doesn't account for any changes that we might see in the development of additional affordable units over the next 10 years. And I know we've got other incentive programs and density buy-ups available for adding affordable units in future development, not related to the mobile home communities. So alternatively, right, to the one-to-one assumption we've baked in here, could it work with a percentage basis, right? So taking that first unit, the first property of Lake Terrace at 11 units, if we assume 100% of the units are affordable by our definition for the 4 communities, to calculate what percentage of the total Kenmore affordable units does that represent? And I don't know exactly what that number is, but if we took, there's 121 units amongst these 4 parks, if we double that to 240 from other development opportunities, whether it's Spencer 68 or otherwise, that greatly reduces that one-to-one ratio, right? I think if we assume 300 total available units within Kenmore, then those 11 units represent 3.6% of the total affordable units in the city. Could that be another way to approach what the affordable unit requirement would be for future development? Is to not target it to the number that they have, but what percentage of affordable units does that represent within the city?
So are you thinking more broadly than these 4 properties then?
As far as calculating the total pool of affordable units, yes. Because that's something that I think that's a number that's going to change, right? Because of other incentive programs that we've put into place, other affordability strategies that we adopt, the total number of affordable units in Kenmore should grow over the next 10 years if our affordability strategy works. So then these 11 units represent a different percentage of the total available affordable properties in the city 10 years from now.
Right, I see where you're headed. I think the difficulty is that in all of the remaining zones where affordability is offered, it's an incentive rather than a requirement. So we have to figure out whether the incentive, what the incentive would result in to make that estimate.
Right, we
I
can't
guess.
predict what the total pool of what the total pool of affordable units in the city will be. We
Right.
hope that it increases because of
Right.
our incentive program, but we can't predict it, right?
Right.
But if we used a percentage model versus a one-to-one model, it would still then represent current state.
So let me
This is
just.
so much easier with a whiteboard.
Yeah, I would. So let me just see if I'm following you. So I think what you're saying is we would make an estimate of future affordable housing, and then we would assume how much affordable housing these properties would contribute, what percentage they are of that.
Actually,
Number?
I'm not suggesting that we make any assumption around that at all, but we pin the affordability requirement on the development of these properties to the percentage of affordable units that it represents at that time.
In 2029.
Correct. whatever that may be. If it goes up or down, it's still going to be, I think, a responsible approach.
So the number of affordable units you would be required to provide would be,
Based on what percentage?
you were of overall affordable
Yes.
units. So you're, I see that, but my fear might be that if we don't see a lot of TOD development, for example, and then, you know, suddenly these units become 50% of the potential affordable units, I could see that could be very problematic. I think that's my concern with that approach. It works fine if you're a small percentage, and so you are not having to do as much relative to what everybody else did, but everybody else is doing it on an incentive basis, and they may choose not to do it, and then all of a sudden you're stuck with a mandatory requirement that might be a higher percentage.
So this is probably throwing a monkey wrench in it, but we're going to look at accessory dwelling units in the fall, right? Looking at that strategy, that housing strategy. And that is a very affordable form of housing that isn't really available in Kenmore. And it could also help get us to not only our current needs, but flex with where the population needs might be in 10 years. Those are all really, I mean, it's outside the scope of this project, but I think we get kind of cemented in when we're thinking that we have to solve this affordability problem with these 4 properties. I think it's better to tie it to what do these properties represent in terms of the total number of affordable units in our city, and then write our policy or our recommendations around. I really like that strategy, actually, because then it gives us a current understanding of where we are. It builds in a formula or recommendations for these particular properties, because that's what we're talking about. And, you know, it should stay consistent over time, especially if there's other opportunities for affordability. It's not apples to apples, though. I mean, you can't say that these manufactured homes, when they disappear, are going to be replaced. We heard all those arguments from the residents. They didn't really want to live in a warehouse situation, because you're not going to really replace the value of what they find in the park. So,
I think it's very true. We don't know what the affordable housing stock is going to be. We don't even know what it is today.
we don't.
So how can we even begin to project what it would be 10 years from now? So, I mean, that's a truth. I think that's something we have to face. So the question is, how do we write code today and plan today, allowing enough flexibility that we can change this and have reasonable outcomes going forward? So what's really different and troubling to me about this particular situation is, as we've already said, in every other case when we've talked about affordable housing, it's provided as an incentive. Here, it's a hard requirement we're trying to write, which puts you into that dangerous situation that Lori described, which is if we don't get the amount of affordable housing, if the incentives aren't right, and we don't get the right amount of incentive affordable housing in the community, the property owners here are going to be stuck, and downtown's got 5 acres of, wasteland until we change something. So I'm looking at that and thinking, okay, if we could change the rules related to this particular property, and if it was an incentive, then it would be on the same basis as everybody else, and you'd be facing the same economic decision-making. The city would still have the ability to be able to look at those incentives and figure out as it goes along how to adjust those incentives to get the outcome it wants. But I think the real question here is, what is the outcome we want? Is there a benchmark we can go against? And the only thing I can say is, well, look at what's going on across King County. What's the percentages? We have them in the report right now. Is that what we want to work toward? That's something I think a decision the city council needs to make. But what we could do, maybe isn't quite what you were talking about, Mike, but maybe what we do is we recommend to the city council, set a target, set a citywide target, and based upon, we're putting up a straw man that says King County. We want to be we don't want to be more or less than King County, we want to be at the King County average. And if we do that, this is what this says. And if you want to change that, if you want to revisit the policy decisions we make, city council can do that. But in order to put a stick in the sand here and move forward, we gotta make some decisions about how we would do that and figure out how you create something that would be a trigger, a mechanism that could be adjustable as you go forward. I kind of like that idea of setting a citywide standard, because that points the city and planning at something you could target toward, and you can measure and adjust and change as you go forward. I'll step down.
And the problem that we also have is we're a very small city with small space. So to try to hit this target amount that the whole county is recommending with growth management, language, can put the whole feasibility thing in the toilet. I mean, there has to be some variables in here. That's why the mandatory thing is hard. And it's even harder because we have this other variable that the city council already implemented, and that's nothing for 10 years. So, we can come up with these policies that, guide the number of affordable units and the actual affordability, but time is a factor too. And so anything we do may need to be revisited in the future and change. It's just a hard concept, because it's like, how do we get our hands around this? And I'm sure we all want to do the right thing, but I think it's like what you said, we have to start somewhere and just.
And I think we've got two hard points we could work from. We could either say, okay, we want to maintain the current number of affordable units, which we define as what's available to these parks today, or it's a countywide average, and you look across maybe the 4 properties and you say, okay, how many affordable units would we have to have on these 4 properties to hit something that looks like the total number and the distribution throughout King County? And you apply that and say, that's what we recommend to the city that it use going forward. If you don't get the behavior you want, then you've got a tool you can use to change that over time. But we're not going to try and predict and be more prescriptive than we really can. We have good data to support.
I think those are both excellent ideas that we could shoot for. The issue that I could see with trying to follow the countywide average is that the county has different areas, and they're not all the same all over. Some cities have a higher average. Some cities have a much lower average. I think we should take a look at our city and see what it needs, and maybe do a more in-depth kind of evaluation and see if we can meet those requirements that our city needs, as opposed to the average over such a diverse county with its different regions and its different averages in each city.
And I think another thing we can do, even though it's different, the TOD overlays are much higher density, correct? So I'm assuming that all of these 4 properties meet that criteria too, but aren't those incentives optional? They're not mandatory.
So in the TOD, if you choose to, that's where the option comes in.
Okay.
If you choose to develop under the TOD, they're mandatory. But
Okay.
you don't have to choose to develop under the TOD. You
Okay.
can stick with your underlying zoning. And the
Okay.
TOD is not applied to these properties, but that would be something to consider.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a couple other slides or points if it's not diverting the discussion too much. If you want to go on with the discussion, that's fine.
I guess I would like to maybe see if it sounds like we may be nearing at least a potential agreement that in terms of the number of affordable units as a baseline, I think I'm hearing from everybody that correct me if I'm wrong, that I believe we'd like to at a minimum match the number of units. Can we at least, I'm not asking for a motion or anything, but it sounds like that's what I've heard as one baseline that we can. Commissioner Van Lyck.
I wouldn't disagree with that, but what I think what our next step is to give Mike and staff a couple of a set of assumptions that they can model against and then see whether or not that pencils out as being economically reasonable. So I could see us picking a number of scenarios here. One which would be, let's preserve the total number of units. Let's pick something that would keep us at the statewide average within this unit. Or if we wanted to go pick some other, we have a different benchmark. We think Kirkland has got the answer to this, or Breyer has got the answer to this. Well, we could pick that, or pick a high and a low end of the county, an average of the county, a high and low end, and see what pencils out in our city, in our scenario. That, I think, would help us move toward making a recommendation or decision, because I think what we're probably going to be recommending is, maybe I should phrase that as a question. Our deliverable to the city council is what?
It's comprehensive plan amendments and then implementing zoning regulations.
That would include us giving recommendations on the number of affordable units, the distribution of affordable units. Okay, so that's what we're trying to solve toward.
Right, and one thing they specifically asked you to analyze was to look at 35%, the low. Typically, we would use 30 for the low, very low, but they settled on 35%. So that is certainly a scenario. For example, if you said, okay, we want to replace the existing number of units, we can look at, well, what if it was moderate? What if it was, what if we met the percentages, which is what you're talking about, maybe some at very low, and look at how those things interrelate with regard to the densities. And again, parking is something else you can consider. If we can't do it with just the density, then that's another area that might offer some benefit.
Well, looking at the numbers, it looks to me like parking is definitely something to throw in there, but it looks to me like it's probably not going to significantly drive the decision-making. If we get to a borderline, maybe it would. So let me just try this. Maybe what we ought to do is think about what are 5 scenarios that we would want to have modeled to take a look at. And I think we've got 35%, which we're being told we should look at. We've got maintaining the total number of units that are in the parks today. We've got what is the mean, if we were to have a total number of units that modeled the mean in the King County, and maybe one that was the high end of the King County, which was the low end of the King County. I think that's 4. What's another one?
Something else that came to mind, maybe looking at trends over the years. If you see that the need for the 35% affordable housing has been steadily growing, maybe increasing that number for the future. But if we've seen over maybe the last 10, 15 years that it's been decreasing, I'm not saying that it has, but just hypothetically, if it's been decreasing, maybe we can project maybe a little bit lower of a number than staying right where we at, because the number is changing, but if we can maybe find some sort of trend and aim for that goal, it might be more suited for the citizens later on.
So do we have agreement at least that, and I appreciate it, I think that's a good approach, to take those different scenarios and then go from there. Does anybody else have any thoughts on, I guess, the next sort of analytical step on that? Does that sounds good? Okay.
So you'll just take this model that you've shown us and move the variables around according to those criteria. I have one other question. When we look at like countywide or statewide numbers, how many years ago is the data? I mean, it's not current data, it's relatively current. But can you give us like what your current numbers are that you're working with that you have?
Which data points are you?
Like
The number of affordable
like
units?
low income percentages.
Well, we have population and income data as recent as 2017.
Oh, that's pretty recent. Okay.
I mentioned that I had some information on existing properties to give you some perspectives or comparison. So these are all across the street. The Spencer 68 and Link are already built already. I don't know if Flyway is still the working name for it, but that's the one I picked up.
Yep, it is.
And I don't know what their how tall that building is going to be or what their parking requirement is, but the densities at those properties look to be lower than what we were just looking at in the scenarios. So if you think that something that looks more dense or is more dense is still appropriate, then, and as Lori mentioned, we have photos of other projects that we can use to help give you some perspective also.
We can send out Mike's presentation so that you'll
Thank you,
have
yeah.
the background.
There's a lot of numbers here to, to memorize.
So I think what we're hearing is that we're going to come back with some scenarios, and we'll try to keep the number of scenarios to a reasonable amount. And then we can look at that, and then we'll bring the photos, and we'll send out Mike's presentation. And we may come back with recommendations next time. The one thing we wanted to be sure was that you understood how the modeling works. So we'll try. to have
Okay, so
something
you're looking for
you
some,
next time.
your note says preliminary direction at the next meeting. Is
Right.
that still the,
Right, that would be the goal, to at least have a sense of where you might want to be headed in terms of these different factors, and that's why we would provide the scenarios, and if we feel comfortable providing a recommendation, we'll do that. So,
Commissioner Mulcair, is your thought, will that be addressed in the scenarios? I'm not quite clear about his sort of 10-year percentage. Where does that sit in terms
Yeah,
of how
I
we
need-
consider these? 'Cause
I need that
thought-
whiteboard.
Yeah.
I still am
Yeah.
having trouble kind of grasping what, but maybe we could talk offline, and then we can
Sure.
think about. Does that make sense?
I think a key data point that will make that more real is if you know what the total number of affordable units are in Kenmore, and do you think the city will always be able to know that?
Yeah, I don't think so. Maybe you do.
Or
Okay.
come up with it, yeah, it doesn't have to be precise, but,
Right.
but it's something that we have a mechanism for tracking if we were to implement a system that measured the affordability requirement we put on the owners of the MHCs.
I was gonna, does that need to be an estimate? Could it not be done such that in, I don't know, some period at 10 years or close by, you could actually do the math and have it then with maybe some, maximum minimum, so the developers wouldn't get in a situation like you said, where they may have to, put in 50% or whatever affordable units. I mean, does it have to be an estimate?
Well, I'm comfortable plugging in a parameter if it's easily discernible. Because remember, this is a phased zoning. It's automatically going to go into effect. So if the variables require some sort of background study to figure out what really the percentage should be, that's problematic. And I think it also limits, I would think, I can't speak for the landowners, but it seems like it would limit their ability to understand what their requirement is. And they may be planning years in advance about what they may want to do.
So that's too much uncertainty, basically.
I think that would be quite a bit of uncertainty myself.
Okay. Okay.
It's the commission's decision, it's not mine.
Well, I think we at least have started figuring out that we need more information. Thank you, Mike, for the modeling, because that helps us to at least have a concrete picture. comparing it to density projects so we get a visual of, what our target could look like. Then we start playing around with, is it feasible? And then could it be affordable?
Just, yeah, I know, cringing. This isn't too far out. I'm just trying to think about how could we make, because I think Mike raises a legitimate concern and one that I share, which is, what if we have a tremendous build-out of affordable, this may be the flip side of what you're doing. What if we have a very successful build-out of affordable housing, and we don't need as much affordable housing in this area, and being it's downtown, there may be other uses for it, like maybe mixed development. Could we make a policy statement that somewhere along the lines, we're going to set some sort of a parameter, so this is our target. If we get at some point, and this is something the property owners themselves could probably do, is let's say in year 8, it's looking like we have sufficient affordable housing, they have the option to be able to go back to the city council and say, hey, we shouldn't have a requirement here that is greater than what the city's overall achieved in terms of the level of affordable housing. So if we've already achieved it, they can at least go to the city council and say, okay, you've already achieved it, can I get some kind of relief there? They're at least, make it a policy question rather than a number. I'm not sure if that helps or not. Maybe in a future meeting we could ask the developers and property owners if that's helpful. But again, it's all part of realizing that 10 years out, we don't know what this is going to look like. So how do we keep ourselves out of, how do we keep the people who are sitting here 10 years from now cursing us out?
Well, again,
Give them some room.
zoning changes, right? And the city council is certainly going to be aware of that. Every year, there's an opportunity to come in for a comprehensive plan change, a private applicant or the city. And I think the other thing that I did want to go back to from the public comment is the notion of making sure that in the future a development agreement opportunity was available for that particular zone, which is not now. So that's a few thoughts about that topic.
Well, as we learned when we first tackled this manufactured housing community concept, I really do think that the city has done what their motive was, and that is to preserve what we have for now. The difficulty is moving forward. So, it's not going to be perfect, but the good news is that there's an attempt to try and put some things in place that really do protect the residents, but also give opportunity to the landowner. So, that's where that zoning piece comes in.
We have one more, and I don't want to change.
Commissioner Van Ryn, go ahead.
Suggest any change to the modeling that you're already doing. But one of the things we haven't contemplated, we made the assumption going in without saying that the development on these properties would be 100% residential. This is downtown, surrounded by a commercial district. Do we want to, at some point later, think about, is there room here, or what would be the impact of allowing an option for commercial development? We know we're going to be addressing office space incentive for that. I'm wondering if that isn't something before we came to the end of this we might want to take a look at. And I assume that's being done elsewhere. I look at some of the things that are happening like Lake City and elsewhere, where they've got street level development and residential, including affordable housing above it. How does that change? Maybe that's an educational thing, Mike, is how does that change the equation? How do you bring in balance a commercial with a affordable housing? How does that incentive work? And how does that change the viability or economics of, or at least having the option of that change? create some flexibility in the future that might make the project look more economically acceptable to a developer 10 years out.
I'm really happy you brought that up, because that's an important thing to consider. And we'll build that into our analysis.
That'd be great.
So is that a different
You've got a lot on
zoning
your plate right now,
requirement?
so.
Would that be a different zoning if it's mixed use like that?
Well, for example, the previous zoning, downtown commercial, is a mixed-use zone. And at least in downtown commercial, I would be concerned if we were assuming it was just going to be a residential project. I guess I hadn't really thought that through, but if we are really intending to achieve the vision, then mixed use, at least on those downtown commercial properties, is important.
Did the council weigh in on that at all about,
No.
with the mobile home community area? Okay.
No.
Okay, lots to think about. Anything else that we need to consider tonight?
I think we got through what we wanted to do, understanding that there was a lot of information presented to you tonight, that there is a lot of research that we still need to do. And like I say, I think we're also committed to reaching out to Mr. Stoner as well, who had some opinions or some suggestions about what may or may not be feasible.
And obviously, there will be public comment for the residents too at some point, either in the public hearing or some other point.
Yeah,
Right, I think,
there
you
will,
know,
there would be a
public
public
hearing for
hearing.
sure.
Mhm.
And they'll be notified specifically, right, about, as I think they were last time, right?
I was not intending to do a
Like a
A
forum.
mailing.
I think we did we did a
Right.
whole series of, well, you guys weren't on it, but we did a whole series of meetings with the residents as well as with the property owners. So you're not
Right.
envisioning anything of that sort for this
I think
project, right?
the residents that understand that the 10-year zoning has gone in, the zoning is in
That's
place now
well-
for mobile home parks, so they
Right.
know that there is some certainty at least for a 10-year period. So that was what we wanted to at least make sure that residents understood that, and now we feel that as the 10 years then, although it's important that they know that, it's really now figuring out sort of the land use and future, which then, we want to make sure that we've addressed that as it's economically viable. We'll work with the tenants, but I don't think we were intending to do a full mailing to each of them.
We did do a mailing week and a half ago or so to let them know what the conclusion of the project was. And in that, we mentioned that there was a second phase. So they are aware of that, and there was also information on how to link to the Planning Commission, and we encourage people to follow it if they want. But beyond that, we were not intending to.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? This is to item 3 on the cover memo today. Policy question 3. The second sentence, staff recommends that the Planning Commission consider future affordability levels based on countywide need. Can you say a little bit more about what you were meaning in that?
Right, so what, in the comprehensive plan, there is information about where Kenmore is relative to this broad countywide need that's described in the countywide planning policies. And that's where these numbers come from. So the countywide need is estimated at 13% for very low, 12% for low, and 15% at moderate. So if you look at where Kenmore actually was in 2015, Kenmore was 13% at low income as compared with 12%, so right in step. 15% at moderate compared with 15%. But where the difference is at the very low income. So we are not in step with the very low income, but there's always a question about how you can achieve very low income through an inclusionary requirement. And that is something that we can look at. But we were hoping, I think, in some ways, reflecting the council's desire that we at least look at, could it be targeted for very low-income residents?
And those will be all reflected in the rent levels?
Right.
All right, anything else that we need to consider or go over, or?
I think we've presented the information that we had tonight. You've given us direction on what information to bring back, so I think we have what we need for tonight.
Great, okay. Great, before we adjourn, I just want to say thanks to all my colleagues for not only tonight, but last Monday at the council. I know Commissioner Van Line wasn't here, but his talking points were. So everybody contributed, and I appreciate everybody pitching in, and I think that makes for a more effective presentation. Did you have any feedback from the council in terms of
Right.
how it went?
Yeah, or do you want to do it, or I can do it? Either
Well,
way.
no, I think we got good feedback. I think, based on the questions, we will be going to the council on, no, we went, June 10th, with a recommendation. So we were at the council, gosh, that was only last night, wasn't it?
It was last
That
night.
was last night, it was a late night last night.
Uh-oh.
So we were at the council last night, and the questions that we were asking them were, do you have any follow-up to the Planning Commission? And they really didn't give us a lot of follow-up. We also presented the recommendations that you'd seen on May 7th, the reduced buffers and complying with ecology standards. So we presented that, and they were fine with that. So I think for the most part, they were very supportive of the recommendations that you brought forward.
There was one word change. Non-vehicular was changed to pedestrian, in a discussion of trails and geologically hazardous areas. And beyond that, it was really the ecology change, and then we found a mistake when we were going through all those many pages, so there were some missing numbers related to a footnote. So we presented that to council. Because you all didn't include that buffer enhancement notion in your public hearing, because we didn't know about it at the time, they will be holding a public hearing, but we expect the public hearing and adoption on June 10.
Great, okay.
So,
Well, thank you for all your work, too, and for all the consultants who worked on it, too. It was very much a group effort. So, anything else for the... Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you.